Over the past few months, one of the prevalent cultural conversations has surrounded the concept of DEI, standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the way that this policy has been integrated into media as well as the world at large. Simply put, efforts to represent more diverse perspectives, be it race, gender, or sexuality, have been met with pushback, scrutiny, and controversy, with many people wondering why this policy is necessary to begin with. So, let's talk about it. Starting with the most oppressed minority of all, gamers.
Assassin's Creed Shadows is the most recent Assassin's Creed game released earlier this year in March 2025. It's the first Assassin's Creed game set in feudal Japan, which is a setting the fanbase was begging for years at this point, as it's a perfect fit for the stealth, parkour, and combat mechanics the franchise is known for. Excitement turned to confusion, however, when the game's initial trailer revealed Yasuke, a black samurai, as a playable character in the game. This resulted in a deluge of videos from people whose opinions are just so fascinating and worthy of your time and energy, talking about how this was a revisionist decision, forced diversity, how wokeness is ruining games, rewriting history, etc. And how it doesn't make any sense to invent a random black guy to place in your game set in feudal Japan.
Now, some people have already pointed out the inherent absurdity in asking for historical realism from Assassin's Creed, a franchise that's previously had you sit in a high-tech gamer chair to relive the ancient genetic memory of your ancestor who fistfights the Pope for possession of the Apple of Eden, which turns out to be an ancient alien artifact which controls human thought. But that's besides the point. After all, none of that is really unfaithful to the game's setting or premise, so it wouldn't be fair of me to compare this most recent controversy to something like that. In reality, it's way dumber. Because as it turns out, Yasuke is a documented historical figure. It's just that his role in history is largely debated. And if I'm being honest, the fact that his role in history is so uncertain makes him a pretty good candidate for a game franchise that's based around mystery and secrecy.
If anything, you have a pretty good in-universe reason for the fact that nobody knows much about this guy. Just say he was part of a shadowy organization that keeps their motivations hidden, and there you go. And look, okay, I've heard a lot of people arguing against the idea that Yasuke could ever have any secrecy surrounding him because he's a black man in feudal Japan, so it makes no sense that he'd be able to blend in if he was an assassin.
And you're right. The fact that Yasuke is the only black man in feudal Japan does mean that he would stand out. He would have a pretty hard time blending in if he was an assassin, were it not for the fact that he's a samurai. And have you seen the armor that those guys wore?
In what world is any of this designed to not stand out? Like, look at this.
That's not something you wear if you want to blend in. That's my fucking sleep paralysis demon.
Yasuke's armor in the game literally has horns. Yeah, that's definitely someone who doesn't want to be seen. When I first saw this guy, his armor and weapon designs indicated to me that he'd be more of a front-facing, tanky character. The big guy whose job it is to draw the attention and take all of the hits. And of course, this was confirmed once the game was actually released. He's literally physically incapable of taking down an enemy quietly.
I must proceed with caution.
So you either have to do it far away enough that nobody will hear you, or have another sneakier assassin do it for you while you cause a distraction. I'm talking, of course, about Naoe, you know, the game's other main character, whose design and gameplay tend towards the sneaky approach that the franchise is best known for. People just completely overlooked her because they were too busy focusing on the guy whose job it is to draw all of the attention. So, ironically enough, Yasuke was already proving his use as a distraction long before the game was even released.
Now, that still doesn't matter to many of this game's critics. They argue that having an African protagonist in a game set in Japan is erasing Asian representation, that it would be the equivalent of having a game set in Africa with a white protagonist, and this argument is funny for several reasons. First of all, because Naoe herself is Japanese, so there already is an Asian protagonist in this game. But more importantly, they already made that game. Assassin's Creed Black Flag has you running around in the Caribbean as a Welshman.
And yes, I've also heard the arguments and seen the videos about how Black Flag was different because it's set in the golden age of piracy where many of the notable pirates were British, so he's still accurate to the spirit of the setting. And I agree, but if that's the case, why does this attitude not extend to the African man who actually existed in this game's setting?
You know, after a while, the constantly moving goalpost just makes it seem like this is less about historical accuracy and more about some inherent resistance to minority representation in historical media. demonstrated by the simple fact that this isn't even the first time this conversation was had this year.
Kingdom Come: Deliverance was a 2018 hit role-playing game set in the Kingdom of Bohemia in 1403. The game was widely praised upon release for its historical accuracy, with strong themes of Christianity and generally being quite faithful to the setting and time period. In 2024, it was announced that the game would be getting a sequel, Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2, continuing the story of its protagonist, Henry. Controversy struck, however, when it was revealed that players would have the option to pursue a same-sex romance with returning character Hans, something that had previously been unavailable in the first game. Well, I say unavailable, but more accurately, the game's creator had previously stated that Henry was a straight Christian man.
This change, combined with a general lack of clarity as to why it was made, led to a lot of criticism and speculation as to why the gay was being included in a setting it supposedly doesn't belong in, and caused many to boycott the game before it came out.
Their argument goes that because of the persecution gay people have faced throughout history, it doesn't make sense that Henry would survive being gay in a historically accurate game.
And this argument makes no sense to me because, like, you know that only applies to the people that were caught, right? Have none of you guys ever heard of survivorship bias before? Then again, people only talk about survivorship bias if they already know about it, so...
But what's really funny about these discussions are the comparisons being drawn between this game and the movie Brokeback Mountain, something I've seen repeated in quite a few places.
Don't get me wrong, it's not funny because it's particularly insightful. It's about the most trite, lazy commentary you could make on this game. It's funny because I don't think these guys realize what high praise that comparison is.
Brokeback Mountain is, on the face of it, a film about gay cowboys, but it's also more than that. It's a film about two people who share a genuine connection that makes them fall in love despite the world around them being so filled with hate towards them. It shows that the love they share can be sincere and meaningful, and the tragedy of how all of that can be destroyed by those who don't understand it, or those who refuse to. It's a significant and important piece of art that brings attention to the tragedy of queer romance throughout history, but also, more importantly, the genuine love that they shared at any point in history, even if they had to hide it from the rest of the world. This is how it's handled in Kingdom Come 2 as well. After the romance, there's an entire conversation about how these characters can move forward with their feelings for each other, acknowledging that they've just broken a pretty serious taboo and that they have to keep it secret.
Historical accuracy clearly isn't the problem here, so what is? Well, I guess Kingdom Come 2 is a lot more like Brokeback Mountain than I initially gave it credit for, because just like what happened with that movie, a bunch of immature people have come crawling out of the woodwork to completely ignore the substance and meaning of these characters' relationship and made it all about how gross and icky the gay sex scene is.
You playing as Henry can choose to kiss him on the mouth and pursue a gay relationship now. Yuck. But it actually gets much worse, and there is a full-on gay sex scene between Henry and Hans. I'm blurring it out. I'm not even going to show it here because it's freaking disgusting.
I picked all the gay romance options and now there's two men kissing. What the fuck is going on, you guys? This is so gross. Okay, that's not entirely fair. Obviously, the people who are grossed out by this completely optional gay sex scene are the ones boycotting the game, right?
And this is the icing on the cake for me and why I will not be touching this woke slop.
So they aren't mad that they've somehow stumbled into a gay love affair. They're just looking up the sex scene on YouTube in order to complain about it, which is, of course, very normal. That clip comes courtesy of Andypants Gaming, by the way, someone who has a lot to say about the optional gay romance in this game. And none of it's very good. Andy is a vocal proponent of the idea that if something was banned during a certain point in history, that you shouldn't be able to do it.
Were Henry to become gay in this world, every person in the world would comment on it. He would be outcast from society. He would probably be burned at the stake for being a degenerate, as was common at the time, etc., etc.
And this argument is really funny to me for a few reasons. Firstly, because it takes the completely misguided stance that Christian morality is a good basis to having any fun whatsoever. But also because it's such a weirdly, oddly specific criticism to have of a video game. You're essentially mad at a role-playing game for having roleplay.
You know, the whole reason people play these games in the first place is to do things they otherwise wouldn't be able to, like horse riding or sword fighting or talking to girls or maintaining a light jog. Not to mention all of the unchristian things you can do in the first game, like murder and infidelity and theft. You know, you can just choose not to do those things, right? Well, apparently not, because Andy also says this.
Is a man who's open to optionally taking a banger in the mouth straight? No, that dude is gay.
So apparently it's not enough to simply choose not to do something. If Andy is even given the option to do something, then it's the equivalent of forcing him. I'm doing a gay sex scene because of woke. You forced me to do this. But the result of Andy's temper tantrum is a sort of manufactured victimhood that allows Andy and his audience to be wronged by this historical diversity. Now, thanks to Andy, this game's gay representation isn't a normal part of history if you know anything, but part of a scary agenda that's wokeifying history and removing straight men.
This is a fear that Andy reinforces in the description of his video, and again in the video when he says this.
What they've essentially done with KCD2 is killed off the Henry we know and love and replaced him with a skin suit 2025 Henry who wears a banana hammock and goes to pride parades.
So yeah, Andy's referring to the game's creator changing his mind on the character he created, which I mentioned earlier.
Now, of course, the pressing question is why this matters. You know, to start with, this is nothing new. Fictional characters get changed all the time. But more importantly, so do real people. They grow, get some perspective, and look back on things that they didn't consider and maybe come to realize things about themselves that they didn't beforehand.
Just like Andy did when he started off thinking he was a Let's Player, only to quickly pivot over to making anti-woke gaming news because that's where the money is. I mean, after he decided to preserve the masculine legacy of Army of Two, a game people definitely played and remembered.
But something that you tend to notice pretty quickly about guys like Andy is that they have to move on extremely quickly once the target of their obsession is actually released, and people can make up their own mind on the games instead of just relying on stills from trailer footage and whatever the hell this is. But honesty and a sense of shame are fatal to channels like Andy's, so he quickly has to move on to the next woke outrage to stir up so that the cycle continues.
The next target of his unbridled gamer rage was an upcoming indie game called South of Midnight, set in a fictional Deep South and starring a black lady as the protagonist. But this video has Andy acting a bit differently. See if you can guess why.
Make sure you act surprised when you find out that the old white woman is racist.
So yeah, Andy's unhappy that the game set in the Deep South would feature themes of racism, which I thought was quite surprising considering his firm stance on historical accuracy, even in the face of critics and detractors and historical accuracy. You know, old white people in Louisiana have kind of a storied reputation of being a bit racist. So, if anything, I thought Andy would have been a fan of the racism in this game.
Not that it matters, in any case, the game's developers have outright stated that the game won't be about beating racism, which means that Andy's going off this tangent based on nothing.
Don't think that I'm only hating on the black women in this game. There's always a black lesbian character as the main character. Don't put ugly black old lesbians in your game. Why is an old black woman making a video game?
He's just seen a black person and, apropos of nothing, lost his fucking marbles. I'm sure that this guy would cry DEI at his own shadow if he were ever exposed to direct sunlight. But, okay, maybe it's not fair of me to boil all of Andy's criticisms of this game down to nothing more than racism. If I did that, I would be ignoring all the other important points that these gamers are bringing up as well, like women in video games not being hot anymore.
There's not much to say here really. Andy and his ilk consider it erasure of straight dudes and their preferences if any video game isn't tailored towards their gooning habit.
And that's not just me saying that, these guys will proudly admit it.
Oh yeah, and Leon was surrounded by ultra hot chicks. So Xbox, I hope you're taking notes. Boom. Hot chicks.
In the case of South of Midnight, one guy actually claimed to have fixed Hazel's character design and what the fuck.
Look, if you want to be attracted to a video game character, first of all, but second, whatever, right? That's your prerogative. If you want to flood every modding page with what you think a woman looks like, I can't stop you. But what's with the idea that anything needed fixing here?
It's not like there's a shortage of this stuff in video games either. I mean, Stellar Blade came out last year and the entire selling point of that game was how horny the character designs are, to the point that it got adopted by the anti-woke crowd. The character designs and art style of South of Midnight are one of the things that resonated with people the most about this game, but I guess that wasn't good enough because it wasn't exactly what people like Andy wanted. They did it again rather recently to an upcoming Naughty Dog game. Just the image of a darker skinned lady with a shaved head was enough to send these types into a frenzy, regardless of what the game is even about or the setting she exists in.
This is how a lot of these controversies can be summed up. It's just a bunch of dudes sitting around pogging at minorities in video games that, let's be honest, they probably weren't going to play anyway, and somehow thinking that's activism. It's becoming very clear to me that these guys don't care about realism, they don't care about historical accuracy, and they don't particularly care about good representation. They're just upset at the mere presence of minorities in their video games and like to cry DEI because they're too cowardly to straight up call you a But the fact remains that while it is very funny to sit and point and laugh at these guys for how brazenly pathetic they're being, the things I've pointed out so far do reflect a pretty worrying trend. This anti-DEI brain rot is spreading harmful rhetoric. The idea that any minority presence, no matter how insignificant or justifiable it is something that's forced, something that is dangerous to these gamers, actively contributing to their erasure. When Andy talks about history from his extremely limiting, restrictive perspective, or gamers decide that there's only one way that a woman should look, they start putting everything in boxes, and their understanding of the world calcifies. Their view of what is normal and acceptable narrows, becomes rigid and unchanging, and any diversity or minority presence is viewed as forced or not normal. It gets labeled woke DEI and is met with immediate suspicion, scrutiny, and very often hostility. And of course, having trained themselves to immediately reject the presence of any minorities or difference without any further consideration, these guys ironically lose sight of what they were protecting in the first place. You may have noticed that for all of the complaining and whining that these guys love to do about DEI erasing or rewriting history, they never stop to ask one very simple question. What history?
The 688s is a 2024 historical drama film documenting the efforts of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, nicknamed the 688, an all-female, mostly African-American battalion tasked with organising the years-long backlog of undelivered mail intended for US soldiers during World War II, an amount of letters ending up in the millions. In 2024, it was announced that a film would be released documenting their efforts, and it was received about as well as you would expect.
And you're telling me that this is the best you could come up with? Fucking postal workers? Sorry ladies, but paper cuts and cold coffee isn't quite the same level of danger as storming an enemy bunker or facing down a German Tiger tank.
This line from The Critical Drinker perfectly sums up the general sentiment towards this film, that it's silly to focus on such a trivial part of the war effort when there are other, more important stories that could have been told instead.
And there's a plethora of stuff to choose from if you care to look for it, like Virginia Hall, or the Tuskegee Airmen, or Ludmila Pavlichenko, or Vernon Baker, or the Night Witches.
And yeah, these people's stories are all important and worthy of being told and remembered, which is why they've already all had films made about them. I'm sure that's how The Critical Drinker learned about them in the first place. It's kind of hard to take this guy seriously when he whines and complains about minorities not having their accomplishments recognized in order to strip other minorities of recognition for their accomplishments. You know, I'd never heard of the 688 before. Despite all the scenes in movies where a soldier gets a letter from back home, you never really learn about the people who made that happen, often because it is seen as a trivial or unimportant role compared to others. And yes, sorting and delivering mail is a pretty trivial task compared to fighting and risking your lives on the front lines, but you also have to keep in mind that this is all they were allowed to do.
You know, a lot of these women signed up to try and do something meaningful, but were prevented because of systemic racial discrimination within the military and relegated to menial tasks like cooking and kitchen work. So compared to that, improving soldier morale by delivering their mail is an important task that did, in some small way, have a tangible positive effect on the war effort. And the fact that they were able to do that in spite of the discrimination they faced should be admired.
To say that they aren't important enough to be remembered because they weren't allowed to do anything memorable does nothing but punish them for the discrimination they faced and completely erase their part in history. Solidify your understanding of the world that excludes them from it, and never question that, because any basis for your ideas or understanding of the world being wrong has been completely erased or lost to time. time.
This is why I think it's so funny when Asmongold, a man who should be less concerned with black people in his movies and video games and more concerned with the black mold growing on his bedroom wall, says stuff like this.
The funniest thing about this is the fact that this is apparently real, but people are so fatigued from forced DEI that they view an actual historical depiction of something that happened during, I think, World War II as being fake.
This is in the same video where he asks why they didn't just use email.
7,000 postal battalions? And how much we spend on this shit every year? Damn, do they have email?
I don't know, maybe take his grasp of history with a grain of salt.
But this attitude does nothing but completely undermine the very real accomplishments of these women as forced or unimportant, and places the blame on the people that wanted to help remember their stories in the first place.
You know, their efforts weren't even recognized until 2008 because their story had, up until that point, been deemed unimportant and not worthy of recognition.
This creates a vicious cycle. Jobs are restricted to certain groups, often because of social discrimination, which in turn reinforces the idea of who is most qualified to do those jobs. So opportunities are only given to members of those groups because they fit the picture of who is most qualified to do it, often ignoring the very simple fact that historically they were the only ones allowed to do it. It is, in a sense, survivorship bias, and it is the exact problem that DEI initiatives were created to try and solve. The goal, to put it simply, is to give underrepresented communities a chance or equal consideration in fields they previously wouldn't have been considered in because of explicit or implicit social biases. The knock-on effect of these policies is that people from historically underrepresented backgrounds, because of, say, racism or sexism or homophobia, are given an equal chance at representation in whatever it is they're trying to do. Critics of these policies have, in turn, jumped at the chance to say that this is nothing more than discriminatory hiring practices, but the other way, and that DEI completely misses the point by hiring someone for their skin color or because of some group they belong to, rather than the fact that they're the most qualified for the position, leading to the wonderful reframing of DEI as didn't earn it, because apparently that wasn't a problem until black people started getting jobs as well. The fatal flaw with this criticism is that it completely ignores why these policies exist in the first place, namely that discrimination exists, and instead engages in the woefully misguided notion that equality is a starting point rather than the end goal of these policies.
It's the same thought process as those dorks who cry about there being no straight pride anytime Pride Month rolls round, or whine about white men being erased anytime a game centers around a black woman. It completely erases the discrimination and erasure that these communities have historically faced that necessitates these DEI policies to begin with.
DEI is not the erasure of history, okay? It is history, the effort to understand, address, and learn from the mistakes that we have committed through it. A history that, if we don't learn from, we're doomed to repeat. I mean, we're already there. Even now, DEI policies across the United States are being gutted thanks to executive orders from Donald Trump, who calls them immoral and illegal discrimination programs. This is, of course, cheered on by those who have been conditioned into a blind hostility towards DEI, and it's having a huge impact on our understanding of societal biases and the steps that we can take to combat them.
NASA, for example, has been ordered to remove any reference to women in leadership positions, a huge step back considering NASA's history of underappreciating the women who made space travel possible, and the work that had to be put in to make sure their efforts were recognized to begin with. Schools across the states have been ordered to immediately cease DEI in their hiring practices, which in practice means hiring from demographics in a way that accurately represents the community these schools serve. Some kids are actively being prevented from having role models that they can identify with, in yet another amazing move from the party that wants to protect children. But on a broader level, government organizations at large have been ordered to cease all DEI programs and initiatives to comply with Trump's demands. Not only that, workers have been asked to report any efforts to disguise behaviors linked to DEI or similar ideologies in a timely manner, under threat of punishment if they fail to do so.
There's a culture of fear being created around the idea of inclusion and not being a bigot, but most concerningly, the idea of learning from history. There is now a socially acceptable status quo that you aren't allowed to question or bring attention to because it's been federally banned to do so. I mean, all you have to do is look at how many people have been deported or threatened with deportation just because they stand out racially. This is the consequence of the rabid anti-diversity that people are being rabidly conditioned into accepting. History is repeating itself. The mistakes of our past are being erased from the conversation, and any attempt to correct them or bring attention to them is called DEI slop or woke erasure of history and met with immediate and overwhelming hostility, including on a federal level.
Even the Tuskegee Airmen, whose story the critical drinker cites as being more worthy of telling than the 6888, weren't safe. Air Force courses that mentioned them were flagged for removal because they pointed out the segregation that made the Tuskegee Airmen so notable in the first place.
This is far beyond a simple reactiveness. It's a concentrated effort to rewrite history. Forget the culturally ingrained biases that shaped it, the damage that those biases did, and even the people who fought against them are being forgotten. Because of this, future generations won't learn from our mistakes. They'll grow up clueless, ignorant, in a bubble, and never questioning their perception of the world around them, doomed to repeat the mistakes of a history that they were never able to learn from. Worst of all, they'll grow up watching Andypants gaming videos. Okay, I didn't want to end the video on such a low note, so let's talk about some things that we can do. Obviously, these deeply ingrained prejudices aren't going to be fixed overnight. Part of why we have DEI policies to begin with is because we are still a long way from resolving these societal biases and the inequity that they cause. It's a problem that requires an investment in future generations to fix, and this brings me to some charities that I want to call your attention to.
The Malala Fund is an organization that works globally to help further the secondary education of women and girls where they otherwise wouldn't have those chances. If you want to help these girls gain more opportunities and escape gender-based discrimination, funding their education is an extremely effective way to do it. Likewise, the Trevor Project aims to provide support and education resources to LGBTQ youths as part of their suicide prevention programs. A feeling of rejection or lack of support is one of the main contributors for suicide in the queer community, and this is definitely not helped by people's efforts to erase the existence of queerness in history. It's important for these youths to remember that they're not alone, and they never have been alone, and this is what makes the work of the Trevor Project so important. Finally, Year Up aims to end the opportunity divide in America and provide assistance and training to people who otherwise might not get a chance to be considered. Considering that DEI programs in the United States have been gutted, the importance of organizations like Year Up in creating a fair and equal workplace cannot be understated.
These charities are all linked in the pinned comment below, and I highly recommend you go and check them out in order to show them some support. Regardless of how hard some people try to erase history, its consequences remain, and because of that, I think it's vital that we show support to the people who are trying to acknowledge that history, but also learn from it and maybe one day work towards making things right. If there are any other charities that you think are worthy of support or belong on this list, please make sure to leave a comment explaining who they are and what they do. Let's try and make this video something of a resource and shine a spotlight on people who are making a difference. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!